Hello, today I'm talking about a memoir written from a refugee camp in 2019, which won international recognition and hundreds of thousands of award money, while the author was still incarcerated without access to a bank account or internet. No Friend But the Mountains, writing from Manu's prison, was composed over the 6-year detention of Behrouz Boochani in a case processing center built for asylum seekers who reach Australia by boat, the so-called wet feet, and are thus prohibited from entering the country forever. Thumbed one text at a time on a smuggled phone, this WhatsApp memoir painstakingly weaves together a community of witnesses around the world who finally enable his freedom and close that camp. With over 80 million forcibly displaced people in the world, Behrouz Boochani's memoir manifests the triumph of an aesthetics that becomes accountability as it addresses a community of spectators across the world. As an incarcerated and stateless asylum seeker, the figure of the stateless man has been compared to that of a subaltern, as they both lack access to modes of narrative production. Testing Gayatri Spivak's claim that the subaltern effaces as they disclosed, I argued that there would be no freedom for Boochani had it not been for the digital media and also for layers of translation and an international community of enablers. Thumbing reports on a smuggled phone or writing for The Guardian or Huffington Post, while inside the camp, Boochani wove together a collection of humanity one text at a time. Although he has written and accessed modes of production narrative, what is circulated in the publishing market is several folds removed from his original tale, which encompass large chunks of WhatsApp text written in Farsi, the language of his oppressors, and translated into English, the language of his prisoners. The book looks at asylum seekers' journey across the oceans only to find refuge in a colonial camp meant to smother hope and human dignity. Boochani's indefinite detention on Manus Island is an allegory for the condition of modern man trapped within an oppressive bureaucratic labyrinth. Only aesthetics can build wings for escape. I argue that through clandestine life writing, comradeship within the camp, and satire, Boochani is able to connect to a virtual community in order to reclaim his sense of dignity and expose their neo-colonialism at the Australian borders. Life writing, even in its electronic form, is a means of community formation and essential for surviving this Kafkaesque mechanism of domination. No Friend But the Mountains is a cry from the heart directed toward the free world. It has received international acclaim, ironically while the author was still in prison. Boochani's unique aesthetics secured him what Gillian Whitlock calls an asylum in space. The Australian Offshore Case Processing Centre for refugees seeking asylum by boat is a euphemism for an extrajuridical prison meant to deter further asylum claims. Built on fears of external terrorists infiltrating the nation-state, recent policies have treated all refugee claimants to this pacific solution. Fear begets totalitarianism. The panopticon in which Boochani is incarcerated for over 5 years rations its inmates with slow death by time. It is constructed in a way to annihilate the cursed man's most sacred possession, his honor and dignity. Boochani, however, is not silenced or disheartened in his quest for a humane treatment of refugees. By resorting to his aesthetic sensibilities, he soars above defenses and sneers at greedily guarded national borders. Writing under a blanket in his hot and humid cell on a smuggled mobile phone empowers the author to regain his sense of self-worth. In Human Rights in Camera, Sharon Slowinski contends that witnessing distant traumas can create a sense of community of spectators who may in turn mobilize against oppression. She writes, Circulation of representations of distant event creates a virtual community between spectators. This virtual community, or what Shoshana Feldman has called an alignment of witness, is one location where the ideal of a shared humanity literally comes into view. The notion of universal human rights was born and is carried in part in the minds of distant spectators. End of quote. Boochani slowly builds an international community of witness to his camp's atrocities through activities such as journalism and filmmaking, again secretly on his phone. He escapes his incarceration through his diaries of disaster. Life writing becomes his refuge, his asylum in space, where the Australian government's embrace of hospitality turns into a noose around his neck. Responding to Lejeun's Whitlock writes, the diary is a kind of auto-hospitality, a kindness to self. Occupying a space, taking up time, voicing of one's demands are political acts. Without them, human rights and democracy become meaningless. This innocent aesthetic strategy of finding refuge in writing becomes his bold political move, though it is not a political manifesto. He takes up space in the Western imaginary, a space denied to him. He takes up time he was not given and occupies a place where he does not belong. In this poetic act of politics, he gains his freedom and international recognition of the crimes committed against humanity. This is what Rancière calls a political act. He says, politics begins when those who were destined to remain in the domestic and invisible territory of the world and reproduction take the time they do not have in order to affirm that they belong to a shared world. It begins when they make the invisible visible and make what was deemed to be the mere noise of suffering bodies heard as a discourse concerning the common of the community. Politics creates a new form, as it were, of the sensual common sense, sensus communis, end of quote. This is how aesthetic acts become political ones. It occupies a space forbidden to them. It takes its share from the common of community, and in that, it creates a new community of witness.